Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, hello, Regis Kilbin is the name, and Hearthstone is the game, and these are the 10 worst classic cards that are permanently stuck in standard format. So Blizzard has deemed that all the classic cards are going to be in standard format seemingly forever, while additional adventures and expansions will rotate out on a yearly basis. The cards we all started out with way back in the day when Hearthstone first launched are around forever. But unfortunately, not all of those cards are really all that good, so we're stuck with some really bad cards, seemingly for the rest of eternity, which is pretty unfortunate. So I wanted to identify or call out the 10 cards that could really stand to be replaced or fixed or upgraded just because we're never going to play them and they're just wasting card slots in the game that could be used for cards that are at least fun or enjoyable or do something unique or different instead of just merely seem unplayable. Now that said, I do think there are some bad cards that still deserve to be in the game and be in standard format forever. For instance, the card AlarmoBot. This is, by all rights, an awful card. It never gets played. There's nothing good about this card. It doesn't have attack value. It's so susceptible, so expensive. But it does something really neat and cool and different, and theoretically, there might come a day when you could possibly build a deck around AlarmoBot. There might be a meta that's a little slower. There might be some crazy big minions that have insanely powerful effects when they're pulled out of your hand. So who knows? Even though this card's terrible, it's fun and different enough that it's not the kind of card that's going to make my list. I'm okay with cards like AlarmoBot staying in standard format. But there still are a lot of cards that are absolutely awful and don't deserve to stick around forever. Like this one, starting off with my number 10 card. It's the Warlock spell Sacrificial Pact. This is a 0-mana spell, and it allows you to destroy a demon, and in the process, restore 5 health to your hero. Now, some people might be saying, wait a minute, this is a fun card. This is a cool and unique card. To some extent, that's true, but the problem is it's restricted to only one class. Only Warlock gets to do this super cool, fun thing that is 99.9% of the time totally useless, and it's only good against Warlocks, because Warlocks are really the only class that has demons. I think there's one neutral demon in the game right now. So even if there were a point in the future where Blizzard released a bunch of neutral demon cards as part of like a Legion, Invasion, expansion, or adventure, Warlock would be given an insanely big advantage thanks to a card like Sacrificial Pact, which is an extremely efficient removal spell. So it's still unhealthy and destructive for the game to have a fun, unique spell with a very powerful effect only a very small fraction of the time that's available to a single class. So this is not a healthy or good card. It's bad all of the rest of the time. It's only good for and against Warlocks, and that's why it really doesn't belong in standard format. So sorry all you people who were still waiting to kill your opponent's Lord Jiraxis. I don't think it deserves to happen. I think this is a bad card for standard format. And moving on to my number 9 spot, it's actually another Warlock spell, but this time around it's Drain Life at 3 mana. This one allows you to deal 2 damage and restore 2 health to your hero. My problem with this card is that it's just not good enough. It doesn't do anything. It almost never sees play. A 2 damage spell these days is worth essentially 1 mana. You've got a lot of options: Arcane Blast, Living Roots, and those spells actually have upsides as well. They're not just 2 damage, 1 mana spells. They have other advantages or some flexibility of some sort. Drain Life, if you take that logic and you say it's a 1 mana to deal 2 damage spell, that means you're paying 2 mana to restore 2 health to your hero, which is terrible. Compare that to Holy Light for Paladin, when she gets a 6 health heal for 2 mana, or there's a lot of 3 health heals that do, or 3 mana heals that do 8 health or more. You start doing the math on Drain Life and nothing adds up. Plus, Warlock, even though they do tend to take a lot of damage because of their life tap, they really don't often run many heal cards, and if they did, they'd need to make them more powerful than Drain Life. So an unflexible, rigid card that's weaker than its mana cost would suggest that doesn't fit the class it's in, and I just don't think Drain Life is a card that needs to be around forever. It will basically never be played Moving on to the number 8 spot, and a theme that will persist throughout the rest of this video. It seems when Blizzard decides to nerf a card, they tend to nerf it into the ground and make it nearly unplayable, and that's exactly what has happened to Starving Buzzard, the Hunter minion. It's a 3/2, 5 mana minion, and that's really the root of the problem right there, is that it's so expensive for its body. And although it does have a very powerful effect that whenever you summon a beast, you get to draw a card, and that's the kind of effect that can be game-breaking in certain scenarios, it's so punishing in its cost that you never have the opportunity to do anything cool with it. Even a Starving Buzzard into an Unleash the Hound against a full board is an 8 mana combo that does draw you 6 cards. It's still too slow for what Hunter's trying to do. And although this card was probably slightly broken at its much lower mana cost in the past, it's now so bad that it hasn't seen play since. So I just don't see Starving Buzzard as the kind of card that ever gets played again, wasting a slot in standard format. At my number 7 spot, it's the Shaman spell, Forked Lightning. This one does 2 damage to 2 random enemy minions, and it has an overload of 2. Meaning that in total it basically costs you about 3 mana most of the time, and it's worse than Warrior's Cleave in that regard, because Warrior has access to Cleave, a 2 mana spell that does 2 damage to 2 random enemy minions, and frankly Cleave is not even that good of a card. It very rarely sees play, and the reason for that is that with the sort of power creep that Hearthstone has seen throughout the last couple of years, most early game minions these days don't actually have 2 health. They tend to have 3 health. There's stuff like Tunnel Trogs and Mana Worms and so many other 3 health minions that come out by turn 2 or 3. That Forked Lightning rarely actually addresses your opponent's board at all, and it costs you 3 mana to very inefficiently do so. And as the game continues to advance, I don't think health totals on early game minions will ever be going down. So Forked Lightning is probably only going to get worse as the game continues to power creep ever so slowly as it does. Because the overload here is just too punishing. Even though the mana cost is somewhat flexible, it just doesn't do enough to take up a full card in your deck list. And Forked Lightning has not been played at all in the past, and Forked Lightning will continue to not be played in the future, making it a wasted standard format card. At the number 6 slot, it is another nerfed card. This time around, it's Ironbeak Owl. Although at 2 mana, this card was played in almost every deck ever. At 3 mana, it's just a little bit too expensive and not quite good enough, especially when you compare it to a card like the 4 mana Spell Breaker, which is only 1 mana more but has 2 additional health and 2 additional attack. You're getting a really nice discount for playing Spellbreaker instead of Ironbeak Owl. So that 1 mana cost shift that Ironbeak Owl got when it was nerfed was really just destroyed the card, because it made it too competitive with Spellbreaker, which is a much better option to run. Because now Ironbeak Owl is not the cheap card that you can slot into the rest of your turn. It's more of a mana commitment, and if you're already making a mana commitment to that silence, then Spellbreaker is just going to give you the better minion on the board. So this is much too susceptible to ping effects at 1 health. It's too expensive to fit into everything else you're trying to accomplish, and I'm sad to see Hoot Hoot go away, but it's a card that really will probably never see play in standard format. Even though silence as an effect is very strong, Ironbeak Owl just lost the flexibility and the mana efficiency that made it such a strong card in the past. For my number 5 card, the chain of nerfed cards continues. This time around, it's the Warrior Minion Warsong Commander. At 3 mana, it's a 2/3, which isn't all that exciting, and it used to have a crazy effect, and that any minion summoned with 3 or less attack instantly gained charge on the field, making it ridiculously overpowered, like with things like Grim Patrons and Frothing Berserkers. But when Blizzard nerfed this one, they took it, again, a step way too far. And now, instead of offering a really powerful effect, this is a pretty miserable effect that does basically nothing, and it's about 1,000 times worse than cards like Raid Leader, which are already terrible cards. So Warsong Commander is sadly, even though it defined the Hearthstone meta for a very long time, now completely unplayable, and a card that I can't imagine ever sees the battlefield in Hearthstone again. Moving on to my number 4 card, it's Headcrack, the Rogue 3 mana spell. The problem with this card is that it's all about infinite late game value, but a very inefficient value at that, and it's not at all about board control or tempo, which are not only things that Rogue, specifically as a class, really values, but Hearthstone as a game is fundamentally about. Unless there is some crazy, absolutely foundational shift in how Hearthstone is played and how the meta works, in which case the game would probably be broken anyway. Headcrack is just not good enough at contesting the board, killing minions, doing all the stuff that makes Hearthstone Hearthstone, and therefore it's way too slow, way too expensive, and completely unplayable. This card has not been played yet, and I don't think it will ever be played in the future either. Headcrack is another wasted card in standard format. Alright, so now let's move on to the top 3, starting off with the card at the number 3 spot. It's Arcane Golem. This is yet another card that the Hearthstone developers decided to nerf, and they made it totally unplayable. Arcane Golem, of course, used to be a charging minion that was a 4/2 that still had the same battlecry effect and that it gave your opponent a mana crystal, but it was very good because it was a very cheap and efficient way to do charge damage and combo with other stuff like Power Overwhelming to find essentially a cheaper Leroy Jenkins that could kill your opponent quite quickly, and that made it fun and interesting and do something cool. But now it's just a 3-mana minion that barely gets a benefit as far as stats are concerned. It's a 4/4, which is slightly better than the average 3/4 minion that you see these days. With each new adventure and expansion, it seems everybody has access to good 3/4s nowadays. So you get a very small 1 damage upgrade, which is nice. But the battle cry is so terrible. Druid as a class and as an archetype, is all about ramping up their mana, and that has made them a viable competitive class since the history of Hearthstone, because wild growth is so demonstrably amazing. So Arcane Golem just essentially gives your opponent a wild growth for free. So now Arcane Golem is essentially an early game board presence minion that has a lot of stats, and the goal, of course, is to trade efficiently. But unfortunately, it makes your opponent advance past the early game right into the late game so quickly that it's just not worth it. So it's at odds with itself. It doesn't do what it's supposed to do, and in fact harms its own game plan now, whereas it used to have a very distinct purpose. Now it just destroys itself and its own goals. So Arcane Golem, not a good card by any means. Blizzard, you ruined another fun and interesting card, unfortunately, and now this card needs a change or a shift, or it just won't ever see play. Continuing the theme of 3-mana minions that just aren't any good, at my number 2 spot, it's the Dalaran Mage, a 3-mana minion that, although it's cool and has spell damage, and that's an interesting thing to have in the basic set for new players to play around with, the problem with this card is that its stats are just so terrible. At 1 attack, it doesn't contest the board at all, and all the spell damage in the world isn't any good if you can't contest the board with minions in the early game. That's especially obvious when you start to compare this card to the cards around it that are similar. For instance, at the 2-mana spot, you have the Kobold Geomancer, which has much more reasonable stats for its cost and still offers you spell damage. And even more apparent at the 4-mana spot with the Ogre Magi, which for only 1 additional mana compared to the Dalaran Mage, you get 3 additional attack. So I can't imagine a world where you'd ever run the Dalaran over this Ogre Magi instead, particularly because they're both below 5 mana, so you still have enough mana with the rest of your turn to do something cool with 1 spell damage. Plus 1 spell damage isn't enough to break the game or do ridiculous things. So Dalaran Mage falls in the middle, but it's much worse than the cards on each side of it, and that's why it needs a pretty distinct upgrade if it ever wants to see play. I've ranked this as one of the worst cards in Hearthstone just completely, and it's really bad that one of the worst cards in the game is around forever, and we're going to have to scroll past it in our collections for years to come. But amazingly, it's not the worst 3-mana minion in my mind. That honor actually belongs to Magma Rager. Not only is this the worst of the 3-mana minions on this list, but I think it's the worst card for standard format altogether. Yes, its stat allocation is unique and different, but it is just completely unplayable in a game where so many classes have access to a very cheap and efficient 1 damage mechanism via hero powers, so they don't have to use a card to remove Magma Rager, making it way too susceptible to efficient plays from your opponent. It's also just very bad at trading in a game that is very token-centric. Everybody summons very cheap and efficient 1/1s these days, and Magma Rager is not any better at killing a 1/1 than he is a 1/5. So no matter what your opponent has as far as minions are concerned, Magma Rager is going to die to those trades, meaning he often loses out in trades. Plus, of course, there's a lot of cheap area of effect removal and whirlwind effects, as they're often called, which Magma Rager also dies to. So when you start to look at this card and compare it to something like the Jungle Panther, another 3-mana card that has the same amount of stats and is still aligned in an aggressive way, and that it has way more attack at 4 attack than it does health at 2 health. But the advantages of Jungle Panther are enormous. Having 2 health makes it unsusceptible to whirlwind effects. It can trade into tokens if it has to, or survive attacks from tokens. It doesn't die to ping effects, and it has stealth in the first place, so it's much less likely that it will just be killed immediately after being played. Even Blizzard has seemingly realized that the Magma Rager is pretty terrible because they replaced it with the card Ice Rager in a future adventure that's a 5/2 at the same cost. So even Blizzard is admitting to the power creep necessary to make this card viable. And that's why, even though it might be cute or fun to have this bad of a card in the game, and it might trick new players or give new players some sort of outlet to test a 1 health minion, it's really just derailing their progress in the game, wasting a card slot for the rest of us, and serves, in my mind, as the worst piece of the standard format set imaginable. And that's why Magma Rager needs to be removed or buffed, changed somehow to make it at least feasibly playable, exciting, or fun in some fashion, because right now it's absolutely none of those things, and the worst card for standard format. And that's going to wrap it up for my list. Those were my 10 worst classic cards that are going to be stuck in standard format forever. Now, I'm sure you think I'm crazy, or I got the list or the numbers all wrong. That's why I'd love to hear your take on this topic. Which cards do you think are bad for standard format, that need an upgrade, that are on the cusp of doing something really cool, but instead will absolutely never see play? Thanks so much for watching, and until next time, game on.